Okay, hello there, ACT enthusiasts. My name's Jim Jacobson. You're watching Grokkit.com, and this is the ACT reading video lesson. So, for those of you who haven't been following along with the rest of the series, maybe you're watching these in a different order than I filmed them, but I've been doing test prep for over 10 years now, helping various people with various tests. I'm sure I've helped 100 people, probably actually a lot more than that. I didn't actually count them. So as part of this series on ACT strategy questions, stuff like that, we're covering each of the individual test sections and giving you tips, and not only just an overview of what the test is about, but tips, strategies, mindset, content where necessary, and basically the things you need to succeed and do your best on the test. So today's lesson, as you can see from this here screen here, we'll be covering what the reading section is and some general reading strategies. We'll be covering two major question types that you are basically inevitably going to see on the ACT, so that's why we're covering them in our first lesson. Things that relate to the main idea and things that relate to details from within the passages. And then we'll be covering one of the four major passage types, humanities passages, and what the strategies are with those. And we'll be covering each of the passage types and other question types throughout the video series. So, shall we? I guess I'm really in charge of when this moves on, since I'm recording this before you're watching it and you have no say. I guess you're in control of the pause button, but I get to decide when the slide moves on my end for now. Anyway. So, ta-da! So the course schedule here, like I said, first time we'll be covering the passage type, the humanities passage type, and more on that in a second, in case you're wondering, what's a humanity? Maybe the voice in your head doesn't sound like that, but that's what I'm imagining the voice in your head sounds like. So we'll be talking about what humanities are, main idea in detail. We'll be talking about prose fiction, how that is different from humanities, and specific question types, author's purpose, and implications and inferences, which are trickier because you're looking for something that isn't actually said in the passage. We'll get to that, though. Social science, two more less common question types, and then finally with natural science, we'll be covering some of the common wrong answer choices. When you have familiarity with those, you are less likely to fall for them. If you say, aha, ACT, you won't fool me, this is this type of wrong answer choice, and then you can think evil thoughts about how clever you are compared to the ACT when you see them and aren't fooled. So, we'll be covering each of these in turn. I think you can watch these out of order, but this is going to, in terms of how this proceeds, I will be assuming, in the way that I talk about these things, that that you've done the previous ones in this series, in the reading series. You won't necessarily have to have done ACT English or ACT Math or ACT Science, although I suppose I might refer to them if I happen to think something is relevant. But if you haven't gotten to that part yet, that's okay. Anyway. So what is the reading section? What does it test, aside from reading, because that was in the title and we figure you knew that already. So 40 questions in 35 minutes. So less than a minute per question, and that doesn't include the time that it's going to take to read the passages. That is okay. The general goal, of course, is that you read the passage fairly well the first time, and then when you understand the passage, you can move more quickly through those questions. So you have four major content areas here. The first one, 25% of the test, will be the humanities. So humanities, this is the one that's hardest to describe to people. Maybe I guess I should have put it last on the list, but this is the one we're actually covering today. So, it's easy to list what humanities are, but not describe them as a group. So architecture, art, dance, ethics, film, language, literary criticism, music, philosophy, radio, television, theater, arguably linguistics. But this is the actual, in terms of what are humanities. This list is actually taken off of the ACT website, so, directly from the people who make the test, this is what they list as the content areas covered. The thing about humanities is basically they are the non-empirical, the non-kind of data and kind of like experimentation-based analyses of human experience. And so, they're all someone's version of what they see, but not necessarily, or not really in a scientific way. They may do things in a rigorous manner or in a kind of careful manner, but it's not the same thing as science. It's about an individual's perceptions without using any sort of measurement or machine for tracking it. So again, that's a quarter of the questions and the passages, so you do need to be prepared for that. I guess I should add that, so this is a pretty long list and we haven't even gotten to the other 4 yet. You clearly are not expected to go out and read about these topics. All of the passages are designed so that so that any question that they'll ask you, the information is in the passage. If it happens to be something that you know something about, just from your own schoolwork or from your own interests, and I guess I would hope that you have some interest somewhere in this list, otherwise I don't know why go to college, assuming that you have some interest in here, you have some familiarity with some of these topics. You may get lucky and have a topic that is either A, interesting, or B, something that you're already familiar with. Anyway, this is a long list. We haven't gotten to the other 4. Don't go memorizing them or trying to learn facts or figures or dates or anything like that. Everything you need will be in the passage. That doesn't mean that the passages are all easy. It does mean that they give you everything that you need. So, anyway. Prose fiction, then, there'll be whole short stories, whole very short stories, or excerpts from longer short stories or novels. No poetry. So that's why it says prose fiction as opposed to poetic fiction. So these are entirely works of fiction, whereas humanities may be, first-hand accounts of certain things that happen, people talking about their life story, seeing some historical event that they witnessed. Whereas prose fiction, they made it up out of their heads. They still follow, the narrative conventions, but, what you do with a passage like this when it's not about things that actually happened is a little bit different, because the author is clearly trying to do something else other than tell you what happened. There's another goal, there's another agenda. That's often true in these other things, too. But anyway, so we'll talk about that next time. Social science, you get another long list. Anthropology, archaeology, biography. Anthropology is the study of humankind specifically, just like, can't even think of another. Entomology is the study of bugs. Okay, so anthropology is the study of humankind, but it does include kind of the social aspects as much or more than the biological aspects. So anthropology, archaeology, biography, business, econ, education, geography, history, political science, psychology, and sociology. Again, all of these come from they're listed on the ACT website, so that's where I got this. I didn't just make this up out of my own head. This is what they say their test is about, and again, you don't need to go reading about any of these ologies any more than you have to do for your school or your own personal interests. Just know that it's a wide range, and you couldn't possibly go study for it, so don't. Just practice questions and practice the test. Don't practice the topics. All right. Finally, natural science, anatomy, astronomy, biology, botany, chemistry, ecology, geology, which is different from geography. Geography is like, hey, how many people live at the base of the mountain? Geology is how did that mountain get there? Medicine, meteorology, microbiology, natural history, physiology, physics, technology, and zoology. Again, a whole bunch of ologies, and you don't have to have studied any of them before you get in there. You will know something about all of them before you get in there. Okay, and so the ACT reading section actually has 3 sub-scores, which is kind of a lot. So you'll have the reading, 3 scores, 2 sub-scores, and 1 major score. So the reading subject score, that's the one from 1 to 36. That's the second biggest number. The big number is the ACT composite. That's the computed from all of the sub-test scores. But this is the next biggest one, and this is one that schools will look at. And then if they are curious at all why your score was... if they're curious at all about what things you're good at and what things you're not, if they're worried at all about your ability to do certain types of things, they do break it down by two different groupings. So the social sciences and natural sciences, the things that have the word science in the title, give you 1 sub-score from 1 to 18, and then the arts and literature, which is of course the humanities and the prose fiction section, those also range from 1 to 18. So if you are really good at one or the other and really bad at one or the other, it will show. Not only in your score, which will no longer be quite as high because you were bad at something, but also because they will see specifically in the sub-score that you didn't do so well on that section. This doesn't mean that you need to go off and learn those areas. It does mean that you should practice passages on those topics, because, again, it does vary a little bit what it is you need to do when a passage is prose fiction versus when a passage is natural science. You know, reading about certain types of bacteria that live in Arctic waters is very different from reading a story about someone's childhood. The way that the passage goes, what they might be trying to convey, varies. And so if you are bad, if you find through the course of your practice that you're particularly bad at, you know, any of these guys, such that it's really actually hurting your subscore, your imaginary subscore at that point, practice more of them so you get more accustomed to how a social science passage goes. Again, you don't have to be an expert on the content, but you should be familiar with what the sorts of things they talk about. All right, what to expect. Reading will always be the third test. I guess you can be glad it's not the last test. But, I mean, I guess you have to do them all anyway. The reason I said that about the last test is that reading comprehension is usually one of the more tiring things for people, that in math. Because it's you have to pay more attention to a wider variety of things, and so sometimes that can be stressful. And by that point, you'll have done 2 tests already, so that makes it trickier also. The questions are not arranged in order of difficulty. What this means is that you can't skip ahead to the quote-unquote most difficult ones, do those first, with all the time in the world and guess on easy ones, or vice versa, do all the easy ones that you can to get a super high score, and then, you know, save the most difficult ones for whatever's left. You more or less have to take them as they come, although if you do recognize that something is difficult, you can bubble it in and move on. So pace yourself. You do need to finish the darn thing. Again, you may remember this from before, or maybe knew this already. There is no penalty for guessing. 0% of the questions that you leave blank will be right. Approximately 25% of the questions that you guess blindly, without even looking, you just pick your favorite letter, 25% of those will be right. And of course, if you do any narrowing down at all, like, you know, I know it's not D because that's stupid, but I can't tell if it's A, B, or C. If you get that far and you're like, yeah, I'm not going to really be able to solve this one, just guess, move on. You have a 33% chance of getting that one right. So, to reiterate, pace yourself. If something looks like it's going to be hard, guess, and move on. If you end up done with the test, you can come back to that one. You still have the test booklet in front of you, so you can go back to the one that was challenging. But you don't want to have any blank. You also don't want to have not done or not tried to do ones that were easy and that you could have gotten had you had time. Let me try and say that again to make sure you understand what I mean. There are some questions that are totally going to be easy for you. I don't know how many that's going to be. It depends on you and what questions you get. But there are, let's just say there's X number of easy questions. You want to answer 100% of those, and you want to get 100% of those right. Once you start getting into the medium ones, those are still important. The hardest ones, whatever those are, whatever's hardest for you, those should be the last ones you do and the ones you spend the least amount of time on. You want to maximize the number of questions that are within your range of ability. You want to maximize the number of those that you have the time to get right. That was a long sentence. Anyway, if you don't know what I'm talking about, I guess you have the ability to pause this video, rewind it, and listen to me try to explain it again. Anyway, so that was about pacing yourself. Move quickly and confidently. So that's where I was talking about not getting bogged down on something. If you sit there and stare at something, the answer is probably not going to leap off the page. Pick an answer, move on. Some other later question on that very passage may suddenly spark some inspiration for you, and you can come back to it. So that, unlike some other standardized tests, you can go back to previous questions. There's no reason not to move on. Unless you're on the verge of solving something, there's really no reason not to move on, and just come back to it if you need to, as long as you bubbled in an answer. Okay. And that's what I was talking about. Don't rush, don't get stuck. So I'm not going to say all that again. Alright, so one of the big challenges with reading is that you're faced with walls of text, and despite the odds, you still need to remain interested and engaged in that process the whole time. It can be hard if whatever the topic is boring to you, whether because it's overly familiar or because you have no idea what they're talking about. If it's, science that you're not familiar with, or a type of art that you're not familiar with, it can be a real challenge. So you do still need to stay engaged, though, because you're going to be asked questions about it, questions which affect your entire life and your future. I'm exaggerating, actually. Your ACT is important, but it's not so important that it's going to ruin your life. However, you still want a good score. It helps. So we recommend that you do what's called reading actively. You read as if you are interested, even if you are not. And you keep yourself focused. I don't know if you've ever had this happen. Almost everybody that I've ever talked to has had this happen, where you're reading something, whether it's for fun or for school. You're reading something, like a book, you know, and you're reading, and you get to the bottom of the page. You can't see it, but my hands are holding an imaginary book in front of me, you know, like this. Okay. Anyway, so you're reading, and you get to the bottom of the page, and you realize you read the whole page because you can kind of see parts of the page that look familiar, but you don't remember anything that you just read. Okay, so that's death on the ACT reading. It's not death. I mean, you can recover, but that's time wasted. Okay, so you need to prevent that from happening, and that's where this reading actively comes in. What you're doing is asking yourself questions as you go, as opposed to waiting until you get to the end of a paragraph or a passage and saying, oh, well, what did I just read? I don't know. You know, so if you ask yourself questions, make notes as you go, you're less likely to do that spacing out. The other advantage of doing these things as you go is if there is a part of the passage that you do space out on, if you have a habit of stopping, you know, at the end of every paragraph to say, okay, well, you know, the chin stroking is optional, but you kind of say, now what was that? Now, if you caught yourself at the end of each paragraph and said, oh, I kind of spaced out there, I don't think I read that, you do have time to read that paragraph again, and you should read it again because you're going to be answering several questions about the passage. Okay, so what is this reading actively? It's been on the screen the whole time, but hopefully you're listening to me and not reading ahead. Anyway, keep yourself focused. Why did the author write this passage? Aside from it being a valuable tool in staying focused, you are actually quite likely to be asked this question literally point blank. Why did the author write this? What was the author's purpose? We'll actually be talking about that question type today. Why include this detail? So if there's some little bit of information, what does it do? What more information does it give you than the generalization that basically inevitably came before it? I guess except in the case of maybe prose fiction. Anyway, what's this detail do? What other information does it tell me other than the author wanted to tell me it? Okay, and then what's the function of this paragraph? That's that little check that you can do to make sure that you didn't space out, to make sure that you haven't lost the thread of the passage. All of these things take seconds or fractions of a second. It doesn't take long to do any of these, and if you get in the habit of doing them, it's even faster. It does save you a ton of time on having to read and reread a passage that you didn't understand that well the first time. Taking notes, so write down, underline, or circle keywords and phrases. Your choice as far as, you know, which is which. Having a consistent system works very well. Your mileage may vary. You know, you can also do, as I've been doing here, doing little arrows next to the text. That's an arrow, haha. That would be a more realistic arrow. Anyway, you can put little arrows pointing to key bits of the passage and put labels on them. So I could say, well, this is the part where that thing happens there. That's part of that reading actively. Don't move on to the next paragraph without writing down the previous one's main idea. This is especially true if you find yourself losing your train of thought within a passage. The more, I guess I will say, the stronger a reader you are, and I don't mean that to sound like I'm passing judgment on people who don't read as well or something like that. Everybody has different skills. If you know that reading is more effort for you than, say, one of the other test types, that's where it's more important for you to write things down. If you have a photographic memory, it is less important that you write things down. You should start with your default being writing things down, and if you find that you're able to understand things without referring to your notes, see what difference it makes. Do keep in mind that the very act of taking notes helps get things in your brain better, regardless of whether you look at the notes again. I know that sounds strange, but they've done tons of studies on this with students, that basically the act of having to transfer those thoughts into little notations encodes it in your brain better. So you may find that note-taking helps you even if the notes themselves are useless afterwards. So just keep that in mind, and that's why we want your default to be you're taking some notes on things. All right, so let's do some reading actively with this passage. I'll make some notes and doodles and give you a sense of how much you can be doing during one of these passages. So imagination is highly regarded. Even Albert Einstein once said, imagination is more important than knowledge. So we have, you know, this quote here, imagination is more important than knowledge. That may come up later. I suppose what people mean is that one can imagine something, maybe something that has never existed, an atomic bomb perhaps, and then create it. Make it part of reality. This is a fine usage of the imagination, but I think it is quite a different animal from the one that is trotted around so often these days. So we have so in terms of the purpose of this paragraph, we have this definition of imagining something. Imagine something that has never existed and then create it, make it a part of reality. So that's a definition of imagination that's apparently nice, according to the author. This is a fine usage, but we're going to get a different one coming up. So this is, I guess, we could just call this definition number 1. All right, so let's see what happens next. And so why did the author write this? This clearly has the air of kind of setup. It's a setup for one type of imagination that you are sort of thinking about the future and making it a reality. And then this is going to be contrasted with some other type, and that's probably what the bulk of the passage is going to be about. I'm not saying that because I already read this. I mean, I did, obviously, because I had to prepare to talk to you guys. But that's how these things go. If you say, well, some say this is the case, you can bet that the author is going to give a differing opinion later. Anyway, so imagine you are a butterfly in a peaceful field is a suggestion you might find in a self-help book, along with the pronouncement that if you practice such imaginary thinking, your life will improve immeasurably. Okay. So here we have another quote. I'm just underlining quotes for this one. You don't have to do that, but you know that it's a thing you can do. It is this notion of imagination that I object to. Okay, so imagining yourself as a butterfly is definition number 2, I guess. As opposed to imagining something and making it a reality, imagining something that just simply isn't true is the definition that the author is objecting to. It is this notion of imagination that I object to, the same one that teaches kids that imagination is the greatest power of all. Tell a child that his imagination is the key to wondrous treasures, and he may soon see the abstract scribbles he creates as works of art. May even imagine shelves full of awards and honors, perhaps even one for the most fantastic artist in the whole universe. The author clearly seems kind of angry about this, that we tell kids to use their imagination. The fact of the matter is that unless the child applies his imagination to reality by learning art techniques and practicing them, his imagination is less than useless. Oh my gosh. Exclamation point, exclamation point. If the pen works, there we go. Okay, so this is definition number 2. Definition number 1 of imagination was a good one, where we are inventing atomic bombs. I'm not sure that's as awesome as the author maybe intended, but we're taking things that we think could be and making them reality. Definition number 2 is a frowny one. I'm a big fan of using smiley faces and frowny faces for just things that are good or bad, because you are actually asked about the tone of passages, and also remembering, oh, this was the good one and this was the bad one, helps when they say, hey, the definition of imagination in paragraph 2 is most like blah, you know. Remembering that's the one with the frowny face next to it because it's in your notes, in your book, saves you some time. Anyway, so paragraph 2 was definition number 2, and that's the one that the author is angry with and is going to talk about at length. So beyond creating a false sense of security or importance, imagination can also be quite frightening. A person with an active imagination, as I was as a child, and I didn't look at the camera because that was really me. I was just doing that to make eye contact. Anyway, sometimes loses all connection to the real world as the mind dreams up all sorts of terrible things. So I sense a transition coming up, something that's going to happen about imagining things that aren't real and are not things that you can turn into useful inventions like bombs. So this paragraph sounds like a transition to some kind of story about overactive imaginations, I guess. So, why did the author write this? Clearly, we're leading up to some big downside of imagination. And by reading actively, looking for tone, getting a sense of purposes of paragraphs, we stay a lot more on top of what's going on in the passage. Anyway, okay, so now there's two different strategies to this reading section, and this is independent of this reading actively, which you should be doing regardless. It's absolutely mission critical that you read these things right the first time. I can't tell you how many people on standardized tests have really done themselves in by assuming that they're going to be able to skim to find every answer in the passage. Without ever reading it right the first time. What happens is that those students typically end up reading that passage over and over and over again, spending far more time on it than they would have if they had just read it right the first time. Then they know where all the right answers are. It's like going, if you have a choice, if you're getting a book out of the library, just assuming that you're going to be able to find it by just going up and down every single row of shelves. Given a sufficiently large library, that's a recipe for a disaster, basically. Whereas if you look something up on the card catalog online, you get a much better idea of where something is. That's reading actively, and that's reading it first. Anyway, so your two approaches are reading the passages first, where you don't even look at the questions. Read the passages first, and then you just hit the questions knowing what's where. The other alternative is reading the questions first. Now, you're not trying to answer the questions first. You're looking at the questions to see which ones are the types of things that you might, that you know you're going to need to keep an eye out for. It's not going to be something as simple as what color jacket was the author wearing on his birthday. But it could be close to that easy something to find, So if you have a few of those in mind, and again, there's a lot of questions, so you probably won't be able to keep them all in your head as you're reading, but nonetheless, you still get an idea of what the general themes are that they're going to be asking you, and having those in mind allows you to read the passage knowing what sorts of things you're going to be asked about. So it's really up to you which one you do. I personally am a passages first sort of guy. I have a small brain and it's all full. So if I try to keep questions in my head, and while I'm reading actively and trying to understand everything, I don't understand it as well as I wanted to. Other people really do keep those things in their head very well, and they're actually comforted and what's the word I want? They benefit from having these questions in their head because it gives them things to look for within the passage. It helps them read actively. That's not me. I kind of like reading things. I don't know. I guess they're worse problems to have. Anyway, try them both when you do them and see which one works for you. Practice some of each and see what feels right. You can even mix and match depending on passage type. Some people might be happier doing questions first on natural science and passages first on humanities. You are always told what type of passage it is. Anyway, we will also be modeling each of these two approaches in the upcoming lessons, in lessons 2 and 3, so you'll get to see how they work. I know you can hardly wait. Alright, so we're going to cover our two major question types today. There's a couple question types that we cover in each of them, except for the last one where it's wrong answer types. But so the first of the major question types is the most major and central of the question types, the main idea one. You are expected to be able to identify the main idea of a passage and the main idea of an individual paragraph. Like what's this? What was the main idea of this part, or what was the main idea of the whole thing? So examples of questions that you might get: which of the following most accurately expresses the main idea of the final paragraph of the passage? And it is important to read this fairly closely, because if you read a little bit too carelessly, you might look for an answer to the main idea of the whole passage, and that would be wrong. They may even give you that in the wrong answer choices. So, pay attention to the questions in addition to the passage. So which of the following best characterizes the main idea of the passage? So there's one where it's not paragraph specific. You have to know the whole thing. And then what is the primary purpose of the passage? That's another way of stating that same idea. So some things to note. Not always explicit, usually no line references. So yeah, because it's the main idea of the whole passage, they could just say lines 1 through 53. The main idea is the whole thing. Some passages, the more sciencey the passage is, the more likely this is to be true, social science, natural science. On some of them, the main idea will actually be part of a thesis statement in the first paragraph, or as part of a conclusion in the final paragraph. You can't count on this, but it can happen, and so you can just take it as a gift and get those ones right, so that's cool. Take note of the author's purpose in writing the passage. We already talked about that. incorrect answer choices may be generally true or accurate to the passage. This is actually really, really important. We'll talk about it a little bit more in session 4, but one of the most common things they will do to you is give you something that did happen in the passage, but was not the main idea. If you're reading a passage about dogs, and then there's a brief paragraph about how lots of dogs get along with cats, they may give you, what was the main idea? And they'll say, hey, dogs get along really well with cats. Well, yeah, that was in the passage, but the whole passage was about dogs in general. I don't know why I picked dogs and cats. It's just what was on my mind, I guess. Anyway, so be very, very careful to differentiate between details from the passage and the main idea. Don't answer the main idea question without reading the entire passage first. Well, people try it all the time, and it doesn't work. I guess except on those social science and natural science ones where they do tell you in the first or last paragraph. But in general, that's a terrible idea. How could you get the main idea without reading it? It's just not likely. Anyway, don't infer any new information. This is the one kind of downside. You know, I talked at length about how you don't need to know any extra stuff about anthropology or any other ologies or have read the prose fiction that they quote. This is true, and as a matter of fact, it can actually hurt you to know more stuff. If you know extra stuff about the topic, you may, without even meaning to, infer extra information from your own personal knowledge and use that and choose the wrong answer choice. You do need to choose your answers based on what's in the passage, especially with the main idea. Don't try to imagine, well, this would be great if it were part of an argument that then said this other thing that isn't mentioned. You can only go on what you've been given. So, that's the main idea. This is contrasted with the detail questions. So detail questions are kind of the flip side of this coin. Instead of the main thing of the whole paragraph or the whole passage, we're talking about details, individual elements that are stated within the actual passage. So these are our two question types for the day. So it'll be according to the passage. That's code for ding ding detail question. Dinosaurs existed on Earth for approximately, and so you just have to go to the part of the passage where they talk about how long dinosaurs existed, find that number, select the answer choice that has that number, congratulate yourself on a job well done, and move on. Okay, and then the author states he felt less ashamed of his roots when blah blah blah. We don't care about the second half there. The point there is the author states. States according to the passage, that's code for detail. So on these, sometimes they won't have the line references, but very often they will. On those, well, actually I'd say it's a pretty good mix because when they don't give you the line references, they want you to, the challenge, the part that makes the question hard, is that they want you to find the right part of the passage that talks about the thing that they're saying. If you read the passage carefully, you should be able to find it easily. If you skimmed, you'll be skimming for a while sometimes. So anyway, other times they will ask you about, you know, why the detail is there, what other information it says, and then they will give you line references. Not necessarily word for word. Some of these things will be paraphrased, so you can't rely on similar wording. In fact, you should be aware of similar wording. One thing that they can do to you, and may sometimes do, is use wording that's in the passage in the wrong answer choices, and then use paraphrased stuff and other vocabulary in the correct answer. So don't just look for words that are familiar. It may be a virtual direct quote of the passage, don't get me wrong, but don't use that as your basis for determining correctitude. You really do need to actually read it and figure out what it's saying. Which actually leads nicely into the fourth point. If you cannot justify an answer directly from the text, then it is wrong, especially on a detail question. A detail question is saying, hey, this was in the passage. If you can't find it in the passage, that's not the answer. Or you weren't looking well enough. Okay. Lastly, negating and qualifying words are subtle ways to change the meaning, even though sometimes they'll capitalize it. You know, all of the following except are details mentioned in the passage, and then except will be capitalized, but it does make the question very different, and you need to be very careful with those. And then lastly, we're going to talk about humanities passages, because that's the topic for the day, and then we'll actually practice a main idea and a detailed question from a humanities passage. So humanities ones, those are the ones that are the non-empirical or empirical means, you know, information gotten from experimentation and observation and stuff like that. So these kind of unscientific observations about the human experience. So you want to find the overall idea. This is actually true of every passage type, but it's perhaps more important in something that can wander a little bit more like a humanities passage. You definitely need to determine how the author feels. The author may not have a strong feeling about certain types of Arctic bacteria, but in humanities passages, which are again about the human experience, the author is going to have some sort of feeling, very often. So, and you need to determine what that is by the time you get to the end. And then relationships, because this is about the human experience, even things like architecture, it's about how people react to structures and what, the kind of the language of, libraries look like this, whereas churches look like this. The way that the quote-unquote language that a building can speak. So all of these things, relationships between the characters and entities, I guess I should say, in the passage are very often the source of questions. So those are the things to manage. And then put it all into context. That's what happens at the end when you try to summarize what the main idea was. You need to figure out what all those things were doing in the passage. So this is clearly a bit of a passage. This is actually the same one about imagination that we were talking about before. So here, we had that lead in with imagination being sometimes dangerous, sometimes scary, and saying that imagination is a wonderful thing is a horrible lie that we do to kids, according to this author. And so this is the continuation where apparently this child had some delusions of monster under the bed, which is, pretty scary at the time. Anyway, what do? We read it carefully and make any notes we need to. For nearly a year when I was 7, that might be important, knowing how old the author was, a monster lived under my bed, a horrible gurgling beast. My older brother, there's another character, who slept in the bed beside me, never noticed the danger I was in. He had undergone open heart surgery while only a child. His bedroom in our old house in Texas had caught on fire twice. His fears were fears of the real world, solid and justified. Whenever the monster came bubbling under my bed, I dared not wake my brother. I knew my concerns would be meaningless to him. No matter how real the danger I sensed, I knew he would only scoff. He's going to scoff, that's bad. So this author, in terms of summarizing what just happened, so the author imagines a monster under the bed, whereas the author's older brother is apparently scared of fires and surgery. We're inferring a little bit. It doesn't actually say that. It says the brother's fears were about real things, whereas the author's fears were about the gurgling monster under the bed. But so we have, in terms of a relationship, because the brother's fears, it's an older brother, because the brother's fears are real and the author's fears are a scary, gurgly monster, the author, even at the tender age of 7, feels uncomfortable sharing these fears with his or her brother. Okay, let's hit the question. So the author states, that's our cue here. Author states means it's a detail question. This is, so the answer is in the passage. The author states that she, I forgot, it's female author. Okay, so I can stop saying his or her. The author states that she did not wake her older brother when the monster appeared under her bed because what? Well, actually, in our summarizing what the point of this paragraph was, we actually kind of have an idea. But let's take a look at the answer choices, and we'll see how the ACT tries to confuse people and maybe get people who are skimming. A, her brother often lacked awareness and would not have been able to hear the monster. Well, I don't know why someone would choose that. Maybe if they, I knew my concerns would be meaningless to him. Maybe someone might think that meant that the author or that the brother couldn't hear, but there's no way that's right. Her brother's heart condition was so severe that it would be unhealthy for him to be disturbed while he was sleeping. This is one to attract skimmers. This is Exhibit A in the case against skimming instead of reading carefully and actively. We mentioned open heart surgery right here. If you caught that, if your eye caught that and oh yeah, he had a heart condition, that's why she didn't want to bother him. Yeah, poor kid. Okay, so this one, extra mean. But still wrong, because of course we read it carefully, and the heart condition really only affected his fears, had nothing to do with why the author doesn't talk to her brother. C, her brother would not be able to understand what the author was talking about. This one's probably I think this is the trickiest of the wrong answer choices, and I guess I just gave it away by, saying that it's wrong. But we do have this sentence here that says, I knew my concerns would be meaningless to him. That's not the same thing as not understanding what she's talking about. So someone can say something to you that's a complete, understandable English sentence, but you just don't care about whatever it is. If they say, hey, there's a mud puddle around the corner, you'd say, so what? I don't care about that. But you don't have any trouble understanding what the person is saying. So that this one's close, but it's still not exactly what's going on. But let's look at D. D is tricky, in addition to being right. So the author's concerned were so fanciful that her brother would not have believed her. The reason this is tricky is this uses none of the ideas or none of the words that appear in the passage. All we hear about were how the brother's fears were fears of the real world, solid and justified. We are to some, and so by contrast, the authors are not. So here, finding out that the author's concerns were fanciful, which means, relating to fantasy, or, fancy in the sense of imagination, that's never actually specifically mentioned. Only the brother's more real concerns are. So this is one where we have to take a step and kind of rephrase or reframe in our minds, because we don't have to say it out loud, reframe in our minds what this means. If the brother's fears are real, the sister's fears are not, or not as reality-based. Anyway, so choice D, clearly the right answer. Okay. So here we are a little bit further on in the passage, so there's still, more to read. The passages can be quite long, and this is why, well, long for something that you only have a few minutes to do. This is why this reading actively is so mission critical, because you don't want to get lost and have to read one of these things again, however entertaining it is. If it's that entertaining, you can go to the library and check out a book on that topic. It's good to have a little bit of fun, but not so much fun that you're reading the same passage for the entire test. Anyway, even though I felt silly for having been fooled, the fact, and this is a little bit further on in the passage, I actually skipped the part where we find out what the monster under the bed was. Even though I felt silly for having been fooled, the fact that I was able to solve the dilemma on my own was a milestone for me. Well, so that sounds like it's important. The author solved it for herself. It reminded me of the time I had nearly drowned. And as happens with most people, a panic set in as soon as I felt I was drowning. So it sounds like we're actually getting into a whole separate story about drowning. So I'm just going to mark this off as kind of a separate bit in case I need to come back to it later. As with most people, a panic set in as soon as I felt I was drowning. I began to flail my arms randomly. I could no longer tell which way was the surface, and I opened my mouth to scream for help, mindless of the water I was gulping in. Suddenly, a calm rationality took over. The surface was where the light shone brightest, and all I had to do was stop thrashing my arms and legs wildly and instead use them methodically, swimming as I had many times before, propelling myself to the surface. And then we can sort of tell that's the end of that story. There's a sharp difference between what our mind perceives and what is objective reality, and imagination blurs this distinction. So this comes back to the author's thesis that imagining things that aren't true is horrible, bad, and don't tell kids to imagine things because it's bad, because they'll think dumb stuff or scary stuff. And the thesis here is that imagination blurs the difference between fantasy and reality. And so apparently not only did this poor author believe she had a monster under her bed when she was 7, she also almost drowned. So that's no good. Now, you'll note that I didn't actually mark up a whole lot of this story. That's because it's kind of separate from the whole rest of the bit that's about imagination. And if I'm asked a question about the drowning incident, I have it marked off, so I know where it is. And I read it, so I remember that the author didn't drown, she lived to write the story, and that there was some thrashing and then some swimming. That's all I really need to know. And so in terms of the purpose of the paragraph, I guess we would say imagination equals drowning. No, not really, I'm kidding. It would probably be that, fantasy is worse or in some way lesser than reality. If I were to say what the point of this paragraph was, that being based in reality, according to this author, is the better way to be. Let's take a look at the question. Okay, so it can be determined from the passage that the author views her realization of the true nature of the monster under her bed as... Okay, so it can be determined. That's code, again, for something that's actually in the passage. And it says it can be determined from the passage. So this could be a detail or a main idea. This one's really more of a main idea because it's summarizing a whole bit as opposed to a single detail. How did the author feel about the true nature of the monster under her bed? Now in this one, there are several different feelings that get mentioned here. We have the author feeling silly, feeling fooled, and also feeling like it was a milestone. So there's some mixed feelings there. Let's see what the answer choices give us. So humiliating because she had been fooled by something so normal. Okay, so feeling fooled is in there, but there's this other side too. So if it mentions part of what you're after or part of what the feelings are, but not all of it, save the answer choice and then move on. Let's see what the other ones say. Be distressing because her father had known all along that his actions were causing such horrible sounds. I think her father was snoring or something like that. Anyway, monster under the bed was snoring. Anyway, distressing, we don't find anything about that, and it's not actually earlier in the passage either. She's not mad at her dad for it. See, relieving because her brother would finally acknowledge that she was actually hearing something. So this does go, there was that bit about the brother earlier. This is one that's meant to attract the skimmers. They see something about the brother and they think, oh, and the brother wouldn't believe her before. Clearly, the author would be glad that her brother would finally know that it was a real thing. A different story could go like that, and this is where I cautioned you before against the dangers of inferring extra stuff. So, but it's not that, because that's not what happens in this passage, which leaves us D. Let's see how it looks. Noteworthy because it taught her an important lesson about the perception of reality. So, the feelings we had here: silly, fooled, milestone, and it was like when she drowned, or nearly drowned, and that how there is this big difference between what the mind perceives and what reality is. So that is actually the whole point of this paragraph and potentially the point of the passage. Remember, we had all that stuff before about how, oh, down with imagination, oh, boo, don't tell your kids to imagine things because then they'll be a bunch of losers who live with their parents for the rest of their lives imagining that they're cool. So, you know, that's what the whole passage was about. And basically, while the being fooled and the humiliation do appear as part of the passage, if we're looking for what the whole passage is in terms of this realization, it's much more likely to be D, because that's what we had at the very beginning, that's what we have at the very end, and we found out even in the part where she talks about feeling silly, she also talks about it being a milestone. So that's about it. Last but not least, we actually, as promised, said that there would be homework at the end of the lesson. So in your spare time and before you get to the next lesson, you can do separate Grokkit sessions on each of these following topics, the things that we talked about today. That main idea of the passage or paragraph question type, remember, where you're asked to summarize what the point was of either the whole thing that you just read or some part thereof. The identifying or interpreting a detail, where you're called upon to look at a specific question within the overall framework. And then we dealt with the humanities passage type, which of course involves the, I know I said this several times, but the not empirical and not data-driven views of the human experience. So, your homework, should you choose to accept it, it's like Mission Impossible, except we really kind of do expect you to be able to do this before next time, is to do the practice sets on each of those topics. And if you do, you will be better. If you don't, I guess you might get better just by watching these exciting videos, but your chances of getting better are improved by doing the practice. So, do them, please.